Hi, my name is Bill Harris, and I'm the director here at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, and we really appreciate you being here this afternoon for one of our virtual programs. And I'm not going to speak long because we have a wonderful group of people here who are going to talk to you about the Federal Writers Project that they've been addressing for a whole series of programs through their podcast, The People's Reporter. So I'm going to kick it over to James Mirabello to introduce our assembled talents and creative people who are going to provide a lot of good insight, and we hope to take some questions from you also. So James, you carry this away and get us into this conversation.
Yeah, sure. And like you said, my name is James Mirabello, and I'm with Spark Media, and I'm one of the producers of the People's Reporter. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you, FDR Library, for having us. It's great to be here. Really excited to be here. I just wanted to give you a bit of background first, and then we have a short clip to play, and then I'll introduce our panel of experts. So basically, during the worst days of the Great Depression, President Roosevelt and his team launched the WPA to really put America back to work. And I know when we think of the WPA, we usually think of people building roads and schools and post offices and that sort of thing, but not everyone is good at building roads and schools and stuff like that. I know I would be useless at that. And artists got to eat too. And so they also created these arts programs for music and murals and federal theater project as well. And part of that was the Federal Writers Project, which employed thousands of writers and editors. And their primary goal, as we'll talk about, was to produce these guidebooks. They're the first guidebooks written for Americans by Americans. If you can believe it, before that, there was only German guides that were written for European tourists, but nothing for Americans written by Americans. So the project really jumped in on these guidebooks, and instead of just a list of places to visit, they really tried to capture the essence of each state, the good and the bad. And in many ways, they ended up creating our first national self-portrait. In many ways. And we first heard about the story probably about 15, 16 years ago when we worked with David Taylor, who, hi, David, on a documentary called Soul of a People, which is directed by Andrea Kalin here at Spark Media. And it was broadcast on Smithsonian Channel. And it was a 90-minute long film. But really, what we struggled with when the film was released is how do you tell the story of America, which is really what this is. How do you tell that in 90 minutes? And that's just not possible. And so 2 years ago, we started talking about the idea of doing this podcast and really digging in deeper on the stories of the Writers Project, the themes that, in the 1930s are still very relevant to today. And we jumped in, and the first season is released. We hope you go and listen to it. It's wherever you get your podcasts. And I also did want to take a quick second to say thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Humanities Foundations in Florida, Virginia, Wisconsin, California, and Nebraska, because their support really made this first season possible. And I think that kind of sums up everything in a minute and a half or so. So with that, we have a short clip we'd love to play for you.
That mirror would take shape as a long shelf of books about the states, the American Guides. Each book would be a mashup of a state encyclopedia and travel guide, with driving tour routes pointing out local highlights. As Alsberg himself put it, here read by an actor,
"The purpose of the American Guide is to put it into the hands of people who don't realize wonders exist at their own door."
But as journalist and author David Kippen notes, what Alsberg called the American Guides, what we now call the WPA Guides, marked a bigger idea than just travel.
The Writers Project was an attempt to introduce America to itself. In the 1930s, I'm not sure America and itself had ever been properly introduced in the first place. America was still a much more decentralized, regionalist country. The guides, I think, were instrumental in helping to acquaint Americans with Americans.
With that mission in mind, Alsberg's agency would become the biggest cultural experiment in America's history. When it ramped up, it had a staff of nearly 7,000 writers, from New York to California, and from Alaska to Puerto Rico. Its budget was less than 1% of the total WPA budget, but the Writers Project produced more than 60 state and city guides, plus hundreds of other books. The Pulitzer Prize-winning poet W.H. Auden would later call it the most noble and absurd undertaking any government had ever attempted.
Nothing's impossible, I have found, for when my chin is on the ground, I pick myself up, dust myself off, start all over again.
All right. Well, hope you enjoyed that little taste. Let me introduce the panelists now. I'm going to start with our host, Chris Haley. He's a historian, an archivist, a writer, a filmmaker, and the director of research, education, and outreach, and the study of the legacy of slavery in Maryland at the Maryland State Archives. He's also a member of the Kunta Kinte Alex Haley Foundation, the Annapolis Arts Alliance Foundation, and the Annapolis and Utopia Film Festivals. And as a historian and an archivist, he's just recently received the Society of American Archivists Diversity Award and the American Association of State and Local History Achievement Award. And just today, I think the Chesapeake Crossroads Heritage Leader of the Year Award. So congratulations, Chris.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then David Taylor is the co-producer and the lead writer for the People's Recorder podcast. He was also the lead writer and co-producer for the documentary. And he wrote the companion book, also called Soul of a People, which was an Amazon Pick of the Month and People's Choice Award finalist with the Library of Virginia. And you can find his work also on the Washington Post and Smithsonian and Scientific American and elsewhere. And he teaches at Johns Hopkins. And Sarah Rutkowski, Associate Professor of English at the City University of New York, Kingsborough Community College. Her research focuses on the writers who worked on the Federal Writers Project and the lasting impact of their work on literature and culture in America. She was also the editor of Rewriting America, New Essays on the Federal Writers Project, which David is holding up right there. That is an awesome book. I think you should all read it. There's lots of great essays from a lot of great writers and historians in there. And she's also the author of the Literary Legacies of the Federal Writers Project, Voices of the Depression in the American Post-War Era. So you should check that out as well. That's also a great book. So those are the great panelists. They'll be talking about the Writers Project today. And I think I'll start with just kind of a contextual question. This would be for you, Sarah, if you wanted to jump on this. Just a little bit, if you could talk a little bit more about the kind of the 1930s and the Depression for writers and other creatives, and kind of like how the Depression kind of looked for them.
Thank you. Well, but first, just thank you so much. It's just been incredible to watch, see this podcast come together, and really an incredible collection of talent and wonderful storytelling. So thank you for having me. So what the Depression looked like, it was totally devastating. It was, huge numbers of jobs were lost in journalism and editorial jobs, publishing, and the effects were crushing for workers, just like in any other industry. But not only for those who were losing creative jobs, but also for a whole generation of young people who were aspiring to those jobs, who were inspired by the writers and artists that came before them, were now sort of without hope. And also, when you think about what writers and artists do, is they respond to the world around them. And just at this time of tremendous economic and social and political upheaval, not just here, but with the rise of totalitarianism abroad, there were these dwindling outlets through which to make sense of it all. So it really tells us, how extraordinary the WPA was, because it offered writers a paycheck for one, but also it signaled that writers and artists deserved help too. As Harry Hopkins said, the head of the WPA, they need to eat as well. So, and it also gave them a purpose. This story of America to tell, and that's obviously what we're talking about today, and this incredible sense of community. So it was a real gathering force, which I think this podcast has done such an extraordinary job at capturing.
And in terms, and this could be for you, a follow-up for you and David also, in terms of the work that they were doing, what do you think motivated the Writers Project planners to do these guidebooks and to do these interviews and to interview all Americans? What was kind of the primary purpose for them?
Well, I'm happy to answer. I will jump. Well, I mean, the primary task, of course, was to put people to work, and there were a lot of materials that weren't published, in fact, in the end. But I think it was really to introduce America to itself. You know, the leaders of the FWP really wanted to affirm and promote the nation's diversity and show this plurality of experiences: immigrants and industrial workers and tenant farmers and, of course, former slaves and women and children. And these were voices that hadn't told their own stories. And this was very much history from the bottom up, that it was intended to let people speak for themselves. And it had this sense of recovering and reclaiming these histories that really would otherwise be lost.
Yeah, it's interesting, just to tag on to that you know, the mandate to create these guidebooks was sort of politically appealing. There was the idea that you could have something produced, but that wouldn't necessarily mean you have to interview and talk with just a huge wide range of communities. But the leadership of the project, Henry Ellsberg and Benjamin Bach and others really took that as a moment when there was already starting to be a kind of a homogenizing of both like media. Radio was sort of seen as like accents were being ironed out. There was the sense that history was being presented as a monolith, but it was an opportunity to really record and go out just this all the communities and get a sense of really America's richness. And that was something that even in the research since then has only more and more been appreciated. I think that's what struck me with the last year. There was a Library of Congress symposium that Sarah co-organized on the Federal Writers Project, and I was struck, just since the research we had done for the film 15 years ago, it was even a greater granular look at the range of communities, and from Latin American communities, Black communities across the country, Native American communities represented, and that are in depth in the archives and in the Library of Congress collections.
James, if I could add too, from my perspective here as an archivist originally, but also as the director of the library, how radical the notion of having any creative engagement with the writing communities, with theater, that was so groundbreaking in and of itself. And that whether President Roosevelt would have expected what came out of it to come out of it almost doesn't matter in a way. The very notion that the environment was such that you could commence programs like this. He did say about even this library, you speak of that granular nature, that the most important correspondence here is that of the American people, not all of the big official memos and such. So I think it goes to a sort of philosophy, even within the Writers Project, that it is bottom up, it's community. It isn't just, and that's a question I have, the editorial nature. Was there an overarching editorial sense? Who controlled the message or the projects within as this unfolded?
I think that's a good question. Do you want to, David or Sarah, or Chris, want to tackle that, the overall editorial?
Sarah, do you want to?
Well, one thing is it's important that this was very much from high up, right? This effort to generate this new portrait of national identity, whereas in the regional offices, as we know, and this is covered really well in the podcast, the FWP was not free from prejudice or bias. They were, in many cases, enacting it. But among the architects of the program, Algren, Sterling Brown, Benjamin Botkin, they really set out to work against this portrait of America that was dominated by American myths and white identity. So it was, and explicitly so. I mean, Sterling Brown really went into the materials and tried to correct a lot of it was explicitly racist. So yeah, I would say that was centralized, and because there were so many offices, you had an incredible range of approaches.
Yes, as Sarah mentioned, Henry Ellsberg's the national director, hired Howard University professor Sterling Brown to make sure that there wasn't the same overlooking of the African American experience, and yet at the same time, and throughout the southern states, the local projects would generally only hire. They would reserve these relief jobs for whites, and so you have maybe in Virginia and Florida very small units of African American researchers and interviewers and writers working. But so there was a tension between that national editorial direction and the states.
I feel like part of the aspect that we always have to keep in mind, as far as the Writers Project and oral histories that were taken, especially for formerly enslaved people, is that there's always this sense, who are you, coming to my house, coming to my home, coming to my community, asking me about me, asking me about my people, and I've never met you before. How truthful is it safe for me to be? Because I don't know where this information is going. And just as we know in the clip that we played, it's a decentralized nation and so different from where we are today, where it's 24/7 between texting, between emailing, between just the latest clip you see on TV. You know what everybody's thinking across the country, if not across the world. Then it really is word of mouth, or maybe if you happen to have a quarter to get into the cinema to see a TV clip of something that's going on, especially in the 30s when it's all about cops and robbers and Bonnie and Clyde and John Dillinger. Somebody comes up to you and they're asking you to tell me your life story as a formerly enslaved person, as a person who's suffering in the Dust Bowl. I don't know what's going to happen with this information I tell you. So I think there's even that element of self-editorialization that we have in mind and we are cognizant of as we go through this whole process of the podcast, of whatever was able to be captured by those writers. There still is an allowance for the fact of the person who's interviewed. How did they editorialize what they shared in that moment? And then they probably wouldn't even know any better until that book came out. And then perhaps that guy would show them if their faith had been justified or if they had felt they had been lied to.
Yeah, Chris, that's a really great point. Throughout the country, everybody, whether you were, especially from marginalized communities, but everybody was skeptical of the government coming around. I mean, in the Southwest, these WPA workers coming around were known as El Diablo a pie. The devil on foot is coming around to ask your stories. So.
No, and I think that's also an important point. In terms of the interviewers coming around, and I know this is something that we talked about in the Virginia episode a little bit, that would be great for you to chime in on, Chris, but it also depended on who was doing the interviewing. So for a lot of the formerly enslaved people who had been interviewed, which is one of the amazing things that the Writers Project did, is they went out and interviewed, knowing that these were stories that would be lost, but many of the interviewers were white, but Virginia put together a unit of African-American writers to do those interviews. And so maybe that, if you could speak to that, the differences there between those interviews.
I think that in and of itself is a great point, especially in any of those southern states where those persons who had been formerly enslaved personally or the descendants of formerly enslaved were more than likely still in impoverished situations. And the persons who would come talk to them, frankly, whether they were Black or white, there could be that skepticism about what is the end goal of this? Because where is this going that the people who are in power in this community, when they find out that I've said whatever I've said about the persons who were my grandparents' overseers or my grandparents' parents, owners or masters or what have you, what will be the repercussions to me and my family who are just getting by as sharecroppers right now, just the skin of our teeth? And the same thing, if it was a Black person talking to you, then you're thinking, well, who is this Black person? Who's behind them? Who has given them the authority to come here? How can I trust this person? Because in any case, if anyone is coming to you as a stranger to ask you for your truth, just because they say that they are going to do, that they're going to share it with the rest of the world to document your story, to what end? I think those of us who are in history today, with the Presidential Library, with Spark Media, with Professor Rutkowski, Sarah, there's always this, or there has been this concern about where does this knowledge go? If you're talking to me about whatever is my personal or my linear background, what are you going to do with it? That, quite frankly, is going to benefit me beyond my just spilling my guts right now to you.
And it is remarkable that, given that all the weights against that the range of really personal accounts that did come in, I was the ones that strike me, like in Wisconsin, the Native American community, which had every reason not to participate, that they, like the Oneida in Wisconsin, because there were people from the community recruited and they were asking for people's stories in their language, they often knew who they were talking to, and they often shared those more. And they created these archives of experience and the language that really, generations after have been prized.
One thing that we've been talking about is kind of the scope of the project, and also the idea of kind of reclaiming history. So I know, Chris, you kind of entered into this project from a number of different, vantage points. As a documentarian who made a documentary about finding and restoring African American cemeteries, as an archivist, as an actor as well. And so I was just curious, kind of how your experiences kind of led you to respond to this idea of the podcast and the Writers Project, and kind of your viewpoint on it with your own work.
Well, I would say that outside of the fact that I've known Spark Media for roughly 20 years, even though I'm only 19, hey, but I've known you all so well. And so I've always felt very good about the authenticity and the direct and open approaches and honest approaches that you take to your subject matters. I felt very good about that. Also, I was very aware of the Federal Writers Project because I was very aware of the slave narratives and how that had been incorporated within the National Archives and the Library of Congress, and just within my years of research having to do with African American history. My initial thought was that, and quite frankly, I'll say naively, was that it's probably all absolutely true. And those formerly enslaved people said absolutely every element of truth that they knew. They felt readily open to share it with whoever came to them. And it was only after subsequent study and subsequent conceptualization of the situation that they were in that I started to look at it with a more skeptical eye. And so because of that, because of the writings that I would see when I would go into the studio to do the narration, many of the things that were revealed to me through what David had written were really encouraging to me, quite frankly, because they incorporated the fact that this was not an easy effort, and not even for the specifics of just financially, but to go into an environment that was not yours being the interviewer, and into a community that was not yours being the interviewee. So for myself, I felt very positive and I'd say even energized about being able to try to lend my voice to guide people along the way, but not be in the way, because that would be the same thing that would have been the fear for those persons who were being, some might have been felt really honored and excited about being asked. Some might have felt they were being interrogated. So I think that's partly of what, the more and more I became involved and read the different scripts and about the different states, I thought this is really about not only the journey of those persons who were interviewed, but the persons who were hired as the, like Zora Neale Hurston and those individuals who were hired to be the interviewers, because they were often dealing with the duality of their situation and to whom they were asking questions, because they could often think that for the sake of one poem or one short story I've written, I could be where you are. And you could be asking this question of me right now. So it's all been a wonderful circle for me with my artistic career, because I get to be a narrator, and also my historian career, where I get to explore this history even further.
And one thing I did want to mention real quick generally is we are going to have some time for questions at the end. So anyone watching, I'm encouraging you to send your questions in. And I did want to throw a question Sarah's way, because of kind of the scope of not just the project and then their goals and the work that they're doing and all the different writers. I know there's been waves of historical interest through the decades, and we seem to be in another wave right now of renewed interest, which is wonderful. And I was just wondering if this current wave has any kind of different, kind of a different slant or different angles than kind of the research we've had in the past.
Well, when Chris was talking, I was just thinking about how that people tend to know a little bit about the former slave narratives, or sort of a vague notion that's part of what the Federal Writers Project did, or the American Guide series. But still, very little remains known about the kind of scope of the project and just all of these thousands of interviews. And I think that one of the key things that's happened, really beginning with David and James' documentary and David's book, A Soul of a People, is really bringing it into the public consciousness in a way that, taking it out of the academy, right? Because the Federal Writers Project was never meant to be consumed by academics, clearly, and yet it became sort of an academic subject. And I think there's this real thirst now, and you guys are leading it, that for bringing it, making these materials better known, and looking at them as not just relics of the past, but as really important documents for how we can make sense of today. So I think that's a really important also, and something that the podcast does really well, and that we're seeing scholars take up as well, is looking at rereading a lot of these materials through contemporary eyes, with many of our concerns around whether it's race and sexuality and labor studies, children's studies, immigrant histories. We can go back to those materials and find a lot of fascinating, actually, kind of fresh perspectives that maybe they didn't even see 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So we see a lot of that happening as well. Yeah. That I think, again, the podcast really does a beautiful job encapsulating a lot of these impulses and interests.
Thank you. And I know also there's also an impact on literary history as well, and literature. We actually just got a question in from someone named Claire via email about Saul Bellow, and she had heard that he worked for a New Deal program, and she was wondering if that was the Writers Project.
It was indeed, and he was very young. He worked in the Chicago office, which was it had a huge amount of talent. Richard Wright, Margaret Walker, Nelson Algren, and a very young Saul Bellow, who, in my research, you can't find anything with his name on it. So I don't know. I mean, yes, we know he worked there. We know that he worked on, I think he was writing bios of different Chicago figures for a while, but he doesn't, his name doesn't appear in
Mm.
a lot of work.
I think some of in the Springfield, Illinois archive, I think there are some of the manuscripts that he has, where his name is on the write-up, like these mini bios of Midwestern writers.
Right, of Midwestern writers, that's right.
So I guess one question about, in terms of literary impact is, do you have any examples of some other writers and how their work on the Writers Project may have influenced their work, which has gone on to impact, American literature?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking also, as Chris was talking about, the proximity of the subjects to the interviewers. And, if you take somebody like Nelson Algren in Chicago, he was doing his field work in bars, talking he was a writer that was particularly interested in sort of these rough-edged characters. And he would sit and talk to people, he would hang out at the jail and talk. So, I mean, there was a real closeness to the subjects. But I would say overall, not only did it offer writers all this kind of raw material, but it also really trained them in this documentary form, and one that would privilege voice and subjectivity. Because you remember that there were some recording devices, or Neil Hurston, as you guys talk about in the podcast, but most of the writers did not have recording devices. They were using just pencil and paper, so they really had to train their ear to. They took some creative license, of course, but to really take down what they said, and not just what they said, but how they said it. And Ralph Ellison, I was just looking, has a wonderful quote. Ralph Ellison, the writer who we really associate with post-war, with Invisible Man, who was a federal writer in the late 30s. He said about the program that, and I'll quote him, "I tried to use my ear for dialogue to give an impression of just how people sounded. I developed a technique of transcribing that captured the idiom rather than trying to convey dialect through misspelling." So there was this new approach, and you get this really intimate conversational voice of this real first-person speech that we really see emerge in the writing of the post-war era, where there was this focus on voice and this real inward first-person inward term, I suppose, that I think really is partly indebted to the Writers Program, and Algren as well. He really kind of became immersed in his character's subjectivities. But like I said, they also were just taking the raw material and in some cases dropping the fieldwork interviews verbatim into their work. Meredith Lesueur used her interviews with Minnesota Women for the Girl. Sam Ross used all of his interviews to write Windy City about the jazz scene in Chicago. I think you guys talked too about Zora Neale Hurston was really inspired with "For Their Eyes Were Watching God" with the field work she did. So yeah, it was both the raw material, but also this new documentary approach that was really like an fused realism. There's reportage with this interest in voice and subjectivity.
I think it's so amazing when with that question is that even as those of you who are listening or watching this podcast, there's different ways to listen and or watch this podcast depending on your frame of mind. Like some of us who are historians, we're listening for the facts. We're listening for what are those kernels of truth that these talking heads are sharing right now, which I didn't know about, which could take me further, which can be my doctoral thesis or my masteral prospect that I'm going to put forth before my panel. And then along the lines of what Sarah was saying, persons like a Ralph Ellison or Zora Neale Hurston or Saul Bellow, they may be doing this specifically to get the answers because that's their job. But because they're going to write a book or a novel in the future, they're also listening to listen. They're listening to hear how this person is speaking and what are the slangs or the the abbreviations that they are using depending on where they are, because they want to make that as authentic as possible with whatever future characters they create. So for them, for those, if there are artists in the audience, they're looking at the way we are responding to a question. Are we using our hands? Are we looking away from the camera? Are we looking? They're looking at it in a very different way than what someone who was just about, I think that old TV show, Just the Facts, ma'am, just the facts. They're like, what is the thing about communication is it 20% words and 80% body language, something along those lines? Those persons that we're talking about who are artistic icons, not at that point, but later on, they were probably looking at the full three-dimensional individual that they were interviewing, more so than just the facts that they had to get down because they wanted to get paid for whatever that task or that assignment was that day.
I think absolutely. I think it also inspired a lot of people to become writers. It wasn't like the project was hiring all of these, soon to be big writers. A lot of the people were just like out of work. They had to prove they were broke, but they were, white collar workers perhaps. And this inspired. I mean, Ralph Ellison said he wouldn't have become a writer really had it not. I mean, Richard Wright brought him onto the project, but he was a musician, and those interviews really helped inspire him. One other thing, though, I would say is that one of the biggest impacts that it had on writing was just the simple fact that it mobilized all of these underrepresented writers who wouldn't have had the access to this kind of exposure or the resources otherwise, like Elwood McDaniel, who I think it's in episode 9, which is a wonderful example of somebody who really was able to write because of the Writers Project.
Was there? Can I ask? I'm curious. The interaction between we talked about creative in terms of fiction potentially, but what about journalism? The impact of both journalists in this, or how did these efforts and the outcomes impact journalism in the future? Which then maybe people didn't think as much as a profession as the job of a reporter. It's a question.
You find someone in writing about like natural science, natural history, people like Lauren Isley and others in the West. And I mean, it's interesting. There are that's a good question. There are others also in the photography field. Just obviously adjacent. If you look just beyond the Writers Project itself to the Farm Security Administration and people like Russell Lee, who was basically as a documentary photographer reporting on communities in the South for things that went. Some of the FSA photographs illustrated Richard Wright's essay, which is basically journalism of 12 million Black voices. But then also there's an exhibit right now at the National Archives of Russell Lee's photography and photojournalism about the mining communities across the South and Southwest. So there's as much visual as there was a sort of documenting influence of this whole documenting America for the New Deal impulse.
Well, and just as it laid the groundwork for the field of oral history, I think the Writers Project really laid the groundwork for creative nonfiction that would come after, and that style of journalism, because it is very journalistic on one hand, but it also is really incredible storytelling techniques. And if you read the guide series, they read like captivating stories. That they're not. It's not bland reporting by any stretch.
Yeah. No, that's what I'm fascinated about. I am fascinated about all those intersections between these creative endeavors that serve different purposes, perhaps, but the very fact that it's capturing these raw materials, that it's providing both experience and resources, is a remarkable thing as well, considering that there had been a means of doing that in such a large scale form in the past.
And if I could, I'd just like to add a word of appreciation to the Library of Congress for they manage a lot of the both written documented, written interviews from the project, but they've also digitized a huge amount of the recordings, both those by Zora Neale Hurston and others, but there were field music recordings, some of the formerly enslaved group recordings that have only recently been made available. They've been in the Library of Congress for decades, but they've been digitizing and making available on their website just thousands per year. So it's really has enriched what we look at that our view of that period, and made the idea of a podcast more appealing. We have all this rich audio from them now.
Yeah. Well, I see that we've having a few technical difficulties with with James, so we'll just keep the conversation moving for a few more minutes before we see about taking some questions as well. If we could step back just a moment, I am particularly interested in terms of how you've approached the guide series. We talked about that briefly to begin with, but as someone from the rural South, what I find fascinating about this is how unknown these works were to those of us in rural communities. It's as if they occurred and then they disappeared from the place where they occurred.
The guidebooks themselves, you mean? The guidebooks themselves?
The guide, yes. The very materials that are created that wouldn't filter down into the place where they were created. And, like, who was the audience? Who were these intended for? And was it just the structure and the racism and as to why it didn't filter its way back down into communities that it had captured the information from?
I could start, but then others could fill in. But it was interesting to look at reviews of the guidebooks that came out. The reviews actually were in the public press across the country, and many of them were available. They were actually one of the stipulations that the project leadership made in partnering with commercial publishers to make sure that the distribution of the guides was wide and affordable was that they had to be, just like maybe like 50 cents for a lot of the guide books, and like those that were done about cities, were like the guide to Lincoln, Nebraska, and Omaha were local bestsellers. So I think in the years after, probably politics played a role in how far they got, how much they stayed on the shelves. But for a while, they were required in all public libraries. Everybody had the guide to their state in the local library.
And maybe it's the difference between more rural and more urban areas too, or areas depending on what its demographic makeup is, as to whether certain communities would be promoted or discussed anyway in a more mainstream fashion.
I'm back, everyone. As I'm sure
Welcome back.
Yeah, apologize for the technical problem there. Seems the more technology improves, the more problems we have. Hopefully I didn't miss anything too crazy. I did have because I know we probably should wrap up this portion in a minute, so we can take some other questions from the audience. But one thing I think is important to ask is why does this matter? Why does this matter to us today? And why should we be learning about the Writers Project and the work that they did? And I would actually put that question to each of you to kind of give a brief answer. Whoever would like to start. David, if you'd like to start, or
sure, yeah. I think that the idea of like who gets to write history is very top of mind. It's been nothing short of the pandemic recently sort of raised the whole question about who gets to talk about which communities are most affected by certain events in history, and which face the most challenges, and what is real for people depends on where they are in life and what resources they have. So I think that the podcast central question about who gets to document history and whose stories get told is very vital now.
Chris?
Well, I think it's very reflective of, from a historical point of view, from let's say a modernist point of view, is that what goes around comes around. And so what I think is so important about us approaching, attacking, producing these podcasts of a specific point in time, which of course goes through many generations into virtually modern, at least 70s, 80s, or even 90s in some cases, is that some of the situations that people were dealing with around the time of the Great Depression or the New Deal are still being dealt with today, although the circumstances, the social media aspects, as I mentioned before, the communication possibilities, accessibility that is available to us now makes things more easily shared and unfortunately more easily destroyed in a way, because there's so much, as we say, misinformation which is going on today. This is almost 100 years ago, there were fewer sources of information, such as what this was creating. In essence, a first-person perception of the West Coast in California, of the East Coast, Southern East Coast in Virginia, and of the mid part of the nation in Wisconsin, which never the twain would ever meet and would ever even discuss what their issues were. And so this might be all you would get, as David said, if you went to your grocery store or went to your drugstore, you might find this guy. Oh, is what happens over there? Oh, I thought it was just about the gold rush. I thought it was just about this, that, and the other. And that's what happens over in Virginia. I thought it was still about farming and this and that. You just don't know. And this is perhaps all you have to go by. And what we have today is people choose which social media path that they're going to ride. And so they're today we delete other choices. We self-delete, we self-editorialize what we're going to use. Whereas at that point, this was more of an effort to create one general resource of what different parts of the nation were experiencing. And I think in and of itself, that's such an important aspect of why this is vital and on time to bring out today, to remind people of what was and of what to be careful of today, because there are so many different interpretations and so many different things that are there moment by moment by moment, which in many cases are just editorializing, and they're not factual from anybody's actual mouth. They're like, somebody heard somebody say this. So I think this is a good reminder of what used to be when there was perhaps more person-to-person interaction.
Yeah, I'll jump in. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I mean, the past is never dead, and this helps. This is history helping to guide us forward. But I would also just add the extraordinary legacy of the FWP, which isn't fully known, right? The fact that it did really lay the groundwork for the whole field of oral history, that it did change the direction of American literature, that it did change the way we think of public investment in the arts, the wider WPA as well, and that it did effectively rewrite American identity in a sense, or at least attempted to promote and celebrate the nation's diversity and a pluralist democracy, and we are very indebted to what they've done, and I think that has to be more widely understood. So thank you for what you guys are doing.
I'd actually love to get Bill. I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well, actually, in terms of why this matters.
Well, I think it's fascinating to me sitting here, in an institution which is in and of itself reflective of a certain power structure, of course, with the name of a president on it. But what I find fascinating about a project like this, and what I think you touch on throughout, is ultimately, theoretically, right, in our system, it is the people who are what we're all about, and what I'm supposed to be as the director here, reflecting, that broader set of experiences, not just the one person at the top of the pyramid, but everyone who's either impacted by or who impacts them. And I think sometimes it's the direction in which the story is told and the perspective we look at it. And what this Writers Project, these products, the outcomes from it did was sort of enable it did provide space for another narrative to emerge, not simply the one that's driven from the top down, but ones that you could maybe listen to for the first time more broadly from the ground up. And I asked the question about journalism because I'm fascinated, because it does shift from you only interview the most important person at the table to making sure that there are other people at the table. So as the director of this library, it challenges us to think about the stories differently, to listen to those voices in our collection, which frankly, we're often set aside as the least important, when in fact, maybe they have more insight than some of the memos that didn't engage people to begin with in terms of the creation of policy. That's a long answer, but I think that it's a complex question. And I think a podcast like this and talking about this kind of program, it's both the intended and unintended consequences when you invest in things and you don't necessarily have an idea about what that outcome might be. That's the sort of exciting thing about it too, is it's going to live on its own at some point, and that's fascinating to me as an archivist.
Yeah, just to add to that, the idea that the immediate cause that there was supposed to just be an economic spur for white collar workers and laid off reporters to have a job, and the unintended consequences perhaps way dwarfing that in terms of the actual effect on oral history, on mid-century literature, on how we see the range of communities in America. That unintended consequences and effects of this are amazing.
Mm-hmm. It certainly, as Chris knows, it's informed our professions tremendously over time. And what we think of is what has value that we assign, who's assigning the value to begin with. And I just think that the more and more of these types of, programs and projects unfolded over the years, the impact as a whole is so dramatic. I don't think that people today, I so appreciate, Chris, what you're saying about social media too, how incredibly radical the very notion of doing these things was. It may seem so obvious now, but it was unheard of. It had not been on the radar within the federal government of this country beforehand in any systemic way. Which yes, I think really
from an entertainment value, even as I listen to the podcast after they've been produced, because of course, as a narrator, realistically, all I'm doing is I go into the studio and David and the team put the papers before me. I look into the microphone, look into the box, and I speak the words zillions of times before James says, okay, one more take. And then finally it's okay. Then Ethan tweaks a little bit, it's okay. And then a month or so later, they play it back for me. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then there's the voice of the actual person speaking. And then there's the audio visual effects of background talking or of music or of a cattle launch. So it really helps, as you say, Bill, it helps bring this story to life, like we take for granted today because of the social media, that we can get every aspect of an interview. Whereas then all we have are words on a text, which can sometimes seem very dry to us. However, in a podcast, it comes to life because then we're given the more 3D AURA oral experience to relive what these people were going through as they were explaining it to whomever the interviewer was. And that's something that, just personally, is always very enlightening and exciting and inspiring to me as I continue in trying to just narrate the words and knowing that later on it's going to be so much more than my words alone or my voice alone.
I have a question just about that to James and David. How did you decide what to? I mean, there's so much to include, obviously, but in that first season, how did you decide what would be and in what order? Did it kind of unfold naturally? Because I mean, there does have this beautiful sequence to it, but there's just so much. I would be overwhelmed by what, where, and when.
Right. Well, it certainly was a challenge, but an exciting challenge. It was the reason why we wanted to do it as a podcast to begin with, after the film, because there are so many great stories that either couldn't get mentioned in the film or were just mentioned for a minute or two, like the Oneida Language Project. And I think a couple of the stories that we did go into with the first season were stories that we felt maybe did not get the time they deserved in the film. So the Oneida Language Project, just for example, was like a 3-minute chunk in the film. We wanted to do an entire episode digging into that story and why that influenced even today the way they're doing histories at the Oneida Nation. They're doing that kind of legacy continues today to the historians and archivists now. And so I think that a lot of the stories came from that, but it was kind of a fun exercise in deciding which ones to pick in what sequence, because it really is never ending. It's forever.
Yeah, I guess I would just add briefly, just to try to trace a narrative path through it. We did want to have the sense of a journey across the country to follow with some of the writers really from coast to coast, and we wanted. I think often the representation of the Writers' Project kind of settles on the Washington office and all the planning and that went into that. And we get more into that in season 2, but we really wanted to start with the sense of really being out in the countryside, gathering those stories and in the case of Virginia, what was the most challenging part for, say, African-American workers on the Writers' Project to be basically historians working behind the lines of Jim Crow to really capture a new sense of their history. And I think that was with that, and then going to Florida for Zora Neale Hurston's work felt like an opening that really presented that thread as a way into that the public might be able to get behind more than sort of a discussion of how that, a more chronological discussion of how the project came about in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, as we look to close out our hour, what does season 2 hold for us? Because season 1, it would appear to me, it's been a great success, and certainly we're looking forward to it going on. But what do we have to look forward to before we close here today?
Oh, sure. Well, there's one more episode for season 1 that will be coming next month.
I'm leaping ahead. We're looking forward here. Looking forward.
Exactly. And then I don't know, David, do you want to give a little sneak peek on some of the ideas for season 2?
Yeah, I think maybe just to say that we'll be getting more into some of the researchers who would and the stories that came out at last year's Library of Congress Symposium. Some of the people in the Southwest, I think people like also, Aurora Lucero White documenting folklore in New Mexico. Jim Thompson, who started off as a true crime writer, was trained in folklore studies with Benjamin Botkin, the leader of the folklore division. Kind of the challenges then between the regions and the central office, and between the Writers' Project and Congress. And so that whole contest of like, well, what are these American stories? What is un-American about what's coming up? And kind of how that unfolded in terms of a real contest over what the narrative of American identity is.
Well, I know we'll all be looking forward to it. We hope we can have you all back, David, Sarah, Chris, and James. wish you the best of luck. It's a fascinating conversation. I think it's underexplored, certainly here at this library, and we look forward to hearing more from the program. Thank you all for joining us today here at the FDR Presidential Library.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
That was fascinating.
Very much.